morning, everybody. Yesterday we had the first session of GM guidelines on GM food and feed, and we will start today's session, the second session uh, on food and GM food and feed. So start that first one actually recap of the day one. Kamusha, please.
Yes, please. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Gauri, and welcome to all participants. I hope you can hear me. So you see, we will have a quick recap of what we did yesterday. So our session started with the explanation of the about a bit about the biosafety project and what are the activities under that, and the regulatory framework for GM foods, both under the biosafety by the Ministry of Environment and also the Ministry of Health. We had a Ministry of Health by Professor Jailal, and then Dr. Niranjan Rajapakshe, chair of our expert working group on GM foods. He gave a very nice introduction on the main safety considerations for GM foods, and very nicely set the ground on what is the risk assessment and what is expected out of this safety assessment, the hazard into exposure and all those basic. Building on that, we also had we heard about the extensive process that has been carried out for the preparation of the guidelines. Before we started the deliberations on the guidelines, we had I gave a presentation on what exactly are GM plants and what kind of novel foods, novel plants and traits are under cultivation, and we need to understand that. And before we move on to the safety assessment, in fact, the first thing is the need for safety assessment. Why we are all spending time to look at this? Because definitely there are a lot of globally 190 million hectares under cultivation, lot of trade happening, and also in Sri Lanka, biotechnology is a key area. Although limited, but some activities definitely started with the expertise available in the leading universities. So building on that, and also the processes, we familiarized ourselves with the processes, that is how the transformation is carried out and how the gene is inserted, and a little bit of that. Dr. Shashikaran initiated the setup, setting out the base process of this guidelines and explaining the concepts and the principles. I think the key message that was there was the substantial equivalence and also the concept of comparative assessment. The concept of comparative assessment is very, very important to in the evaluation of the GM foods, GM plants, and that was very nicely explained by sir, and also illustrated using a little about the BT brinjal as a case study that we shared. So one of the key messages which came from Dr. Shashikaran's presentation was that in this comparative assessment also, what we are looking at is the defined differences. We are not looking at the whole food safety assessment, because that has a history of safe use. If I take brinjal, the brinjal has been consumed for years. If I take corn, the corn is consumed for years. Any plant which is there, it has a history of safe use, in spite of the fact that there might be certain toxins in them. So we have learnt our way on how to deal with those toxins present in our food. There are foods which we first boil and eat, we peel off, and all those kind of things are there. The way of processing, the way of cooking, and the way of dealing with that. So based on this history of safe use, the only difference which comes is the gene that we have inserted and the protein that is expressed out of it. So our food safety assessment has to focus on these two things. And also we have to keep the environment and the food separate. Environmental safety assessment and food safety assessment separately. So this all covers the information up to section 3 or 4, I don't know, where's the guidelines? So section 3 or 4 of the guidelines, where we have explained the framework. The next section is very important and it focuses on information requirements. And that is what is going to be dealt with today. So information requirements are broadly, we have divided the requirements in the guidelines into 4 presentations. So one presentation flows from another, and 2 will be given by me and 2 by Dr. Shashikaran on toxicity and composition analysis. So with this background, I would like to start with this section, which is to work on the information requirements for the safety assessment. Just a minute, I will just share my slides. So this is section 4 and 5 of the guidelines. 4 is on the basic information and 5 on the safety assessment. And this is what we are going to talk about. Just for the purpose of this drafting this program, I clubbed certain sections into characteristics of the genetic modification. So, but this is not what is the term used inside. We have molecular characterization, donor organism, and so on, as you would see that. So coming back to like a bit of a recap again, that what were GM plants? They were created using molecular biology techniques, transformation to insert one or a few specific genes, and these genes, please remember, plants, animals, microbes, anything can be the source. Then we also we thought that there is a host organism, which is our conventional crop, which is also equally genetically complex. And it has, as Dr. Shashikaran had explained, that it is a complex mixture of macro and micro nutrients, but these have been consumed in food and feed for decades, centuries or thousands of years probably. Now the genetic engineering and accordingly have been modified several times in nature through the selection or mutations and so on and so forth. Genetic engineering is used for introducing specific genes in a more efficient way. See, one thing to remember is that GM plants are not all alike. They are all very different. Their function and modifications differ markedly. So case by case assessment is the key to the thing, All of you as a risk assessors, as communicators or developers, in whatever way you are associated, case by case is very, very important to understand. Every product is different and every product has to be dealt with differently. There is not yesterday Dr. Shashikaran mentioned that there is not a single test which can say that this GM food is safe or this is not safe. He talked about weight of evidence approach. He talked about applicability of different parameters. So those are all very, very important. I have just put here very randomly, this is not any comprehensive list, just to put forth my point to you that the function can be as different as insect resistance, disease resistance, herbicide tolerant, nutritional enhancement, environmental response, drought or salt tolerance. See, I gave few examples of all these in my presentation, and there are many more in the development. So in future years, you might have many examples, but then one has to remember that GM plants are not all alike. The protein expression would different. The kind of protein which is expressed will be different. There might be, now we have the technologies of RNA expression, RNAi, RNA interference, metabolite expression, and this all will go on and move forward because research is advancing at a very rapid pace. So as an evaluator, as a safety assessor, what do we look at? So the first line is again reiterating the fact that each product is to be evaluated on a case by case basis. But broadly, what does the evaluation focus on? And what are the information requirements? This would be, I would look at what is the host plant? What are the characteristics of the host plant? What are the characteristics of the donor organisms? From which I am taking the gene. You see, all this provides me a broad knowledge on natural range and variation of key components potential toxicity and allergenicity of donor gene products. Molecular characterization has to be done to understand where it has been inserted, what modification process has been used, what is the genetic stability, and what are the expressed proteins. So actually this is wrongly written. Basic information is section 4. Section 4 is, of our guidelines, which deals with these two broadly. The second comes the safety assessment, which also sir explained yesterday that there may be direct or indirect effects. So direct is that I am trying to see the toxicity and allergenicity of the new protein which has come. Now it is not necessary that every, we recall the previous slide. There might be, in this slide where we say nutritional enhancement, it may be something which we are regularly consuming. So toxicity may not be applicable there. Allergenicity may not be applicable. It may be RNAi where you are not actually introducing any protein. So this will all be on a case by case basis, but nutritional and compositional analysis will be something which is mostly done basically to understand the unintended effect, as sir will explain you as we go along. So in our guidelines, this has been clubbed into two parts: basic information and the safety assessment requirements. So what I'm going to do is, in this presentation, I'm going to talk mostly on that basic information component, and then safety assessment, that toxicity allergenicity part will be dealt with subsequently. So if I look at the characteristics of the genetic modification, now it is very important to remain focused. You see, when you are doing the food safety evaluation, the only thing in your mind should be, what are the parameters important for food safety? So when I am characterizing the genes and insertions, understanding the function of that particular GM, understanding the safety and use of the host organisms, verify the intended GM contains appropriate genes and their functional, estimate the exposure of the novel protein, and identify any unintended changes, and if so, safety has to be evaluated. This is the broad approach that I have to keep. Now to operationalize this approach, all these things are nice words, but like, in fact, I would like to quote here Dr. Pereira. He used to always say, all this discussion is okay, but how exactly is to be done? What information do I have to look into? So for doing that, you have to look at your guidelines, because that is what has been explained very properly. So what all I explained in the previous slide, now this is exactly how it is in your guidelines. I'm going to correlate everything to the guidelines, because we will be presenting and we will be gone. We will share our slides with you. We will make a small training module, and that also will be shared. But even then, these guidelines, as and when they are accepted by the government, they would be the one which have to be followed. So everything else is extra explanation to make you understand. But the assessments will have to be done as per the following the guidelines. So in the guidelines, there are 5 types of information that we are asking. Description of the GE plant, that's very important. After all, whatever the product is, we need to know what it is. Like I said, BT brinjal. So what is BT brinjal? It's a brinjal with Cry1AC from Bacillus thuringiensis inserted into it. So that's the kind of information that I'm saying in a very loose way, but there are subsections of that properly explained in the guidelines, and which I will explain further. Description of the unmodified host plant. Even yesterday we said, and I am repeating it, the unmodified host plant is also very, very important. We must know full about it and its use as food. Because when you are changing it, your use may be changing or anything may be happening. So the knowledge of unmodified plant is very important. Description on the dose, description of the genetic modification, or there may be more than one, and then is the molecular characterization. Now, if I look at the description of the GE plant, basically I need to identify which is the crop, then the pedigree map for each transformation event, name of the transformation event, and what is the purpose for which this has been modified. So all that explanation has to be provided fully. Description of the unmodified host plant and its use. So again, now I'm taking you back to my previous slide where I said throughout your description requirements, keep your focus on food safety. So when I'm asking information about unmodified host plant, I'm asking, information on whether there is any known toxicity or allergenicity. History of safe use for consumption as food. Things like center of origin, varieties, all that will become in environmental assessment. So we have to very distinctly think that when my focus is on food safety, I'm just thinking of these things. History of safe use for consumption as food and any known nutrients, anti-nutrients, toxins, allergens, and so on. How they are important, you will learn as you go along this, History of safe use and dietary exposure. This is very important. How the plant is typically cultivated, transported, stored, information on special processing requirement to make the plant safe to eat, plant's normal role in the diet. Sir will explain you subsequently that how important it is that how much of it we consume in our diet. For planning the safety studies, is consumption of the plant important in particular subgroups of the population? What important macro or micronutrients does the plant contribute to the diet? So this is the kind of information we are looking at to information. So this will help us, take on our decisions subsequently. The critical questions that can help reduce uncertainty of safety: has the host species been consumed by humans or other mammals without evidence of unexpected harm? Has the gene donor, source of gene, and the protein, if expressed, been consumed by humans and other animals? So both the things. If there is no history of safe use, even then it doesn't mean it is unsafe, but there is only less certainty of safety, so it may require additional testing. You see, I was talking the other day to a colleague in ICRISAT, and they were saying that, there are some kind of problems which are being dealt with through genetic interventions, things like rancidity in sorghum and like that, So she was explaining so many traits, and even you have to understand when you are doing your safety assessment as a product developer or as a risk assessor, if there is a problem, is it because of that gene or is it because of the inherent characters of that plant? So these two have to be differentiated in a very, very clearly. Otherwise, we will be stopping the products, stopping maybe the beneficial products. This is also very important, All GM is not bad. GM research is being done to take benefit of this technology for the betterment. So if these, that's a different question, that whether the country wants it or not, but I'm talking in general. So in general, the genetic modification technology is definitely to create some benefits. So not adopting the technology also may be harmful in some ways. That's why all this is very important to know. Is my intervention useful or harmful, and whether it should be adopted? So we, through these guidelines, are only answering it scientifically. There may be several other. Tomorrow I will discuss about that in my risk communication presentation. Whether it is approved by the country, accepted by the public, and all that is a secondary issue which we will deal with later. But at this point of time, scientifically, we need to first know whether it is safe or not. And for that, the history of safe use, the knowledge about the unmodified host plant is very, very important. So the next is our description of the donor organisms. So here we will take complete information about natural history of the organism. For donor microorganisms, if this is a microorganism, we should know whether it causes any, has any human pathogenicity issues or the relationship to the non-human pathogens. And also the last one is very important, the information on its past and present use, if any, in the food supply, and exposure route other than intended food use. So now please recall what I said just now in my previous slide, that even if it is not used in the food so far, it doesn't mean that it is not to be adopted, not to be studied further. But the only thing is we have to do more testing to be sure of, our results and to be sure of the food safety. So the third important thing which comes is the molecular characterization. Molecular characterization is used to gain understanding of the genetic material introduced and expressed in the GM plant. I have added a gene. Where exactly it has been inserted? Is it not disturbing any other metabolic pathway? And the complete positioning of the gene is understood. And there are a lot of, advanced techniques available now to answer these questions, and very easily it is done, as our colleagues from molecular biology would know. It also possibly addresses concerns on any positional effects, pleiotropic effects, gene silencing, provides information on the composition and integrity of the inserted gene, and also ensures that developer has appropriately characterized the genetic modification. Now we have included certain guidance in the, the guidelines have some information on how to do that. But in case there is any doubt or one wants to look at the advanced information, this is a document which is produced by OECD, and the document is on consensus document on molecular characterization of plants derived from modern biotechnology. This document was made after years of consultation by a very senior group of experts, and globally, for any doubts on molecular characterization, this is the most referred document. So I thought I will just add it here, and in case anybody has a doubt whether it is the developer or the assessor, you can look for this particular document. Molecular characterization would consist of basically three things. What is the transformation method used? So here you will have to correlate what I said yesterday. There are two commonly used transformation methods. One is the agrobacterium based, another is the gene gun. So we have to look at which transformation method has been used. Inserted DNA insertion site and what it is expressing. And the third important thing is inheritance and genetic stability. Whether this is getting inherited in subsequent generations in its intact form, or there is, and also if there is a genetic stability, means there is no segregation, and the trait is not getting segregated and so on. So as we know, this is something I don't need to say, but I just added it because this is our central dogma of life, DNA to RNA to protein. So where I added this because I thought there might be some people from Ministry of Health who may not be familiar with the basics of genetic engineering. So when you have a gene, ultimately it gives the, the result is the protein in the cell. So we have to test the safety of the protein that it is expressing. Expression of CRY1AC in cotton, I've just given this example. This was the gene, and it gets translated into mRNA and we get a protein, and this is the protein that we get CRY1AC, protection against specific insect pests. So the genetic intervention that I have made by adding this piece of DNA is leading to production of this protein, and this protein is the defined difference between cotton and BT cotton. So my subsequent studies are going to be focused on ensuring the safety of the CRY1AC gene, CRY1AC protein. But this is just another example where I just wanted to show that it is when we add CRY1AC gene or anything, the molecular biologists would know, of course, for the information of others. This is our gene for CRY1AC, but there will be a promoter sequence and there will be a terminator sequence, and there might be a marker gene for assistance in the selection. So I have to see, and that marker gene may also be producing another protein. So when I say CRY1AC protein, when I say the products, the proteins expressed from the inserted piece of DNA, it may be one protein, it may be two proteins, and all whatever is being expressed has to be studied for safety. So the method by which it is introduced or anything, and again, I've just repeated this slide just to reiterate the last point, that when we are analyzing these methods, or when we are also analyzing the sequence which has come, the focus has to remain to the safety assessment, to the food safety assessment. Now, among the transformation methods, Agrobacterium transformation has the lowest incidence of multiple inserts. So you see, you have a Criver-SE gene and you want that I want to introduce this. So my transformation method should be such that it gives only one insert. You know, I want only one copy or I want two copies. So how to manage that? So Agrobacterium transformation is known to have the lowest incidence of multiple inserts, whereas the gene gun has the highest incidence of multiple this thing. So how do we choose, you know, which agrobacterium method is used, which method, transformation method is used, better for which host species? So this choice is dictated by the host species, and also whether the organism reproduces sexually or resexually. For example, potato and other clonal species are at very low risk for genetic recombination because they are, you know, asexually transmitted. Soybean may be hybrid, although self-fertile crop. Agrobacterium may be used or biolistics may be used, but generally agrobacterium has been successfully used. So maize is mostly hybrid breeding and agrobacterium is used. These are just the examples to familiarize you that, you know, this we don't have to dictate as anything, but we have to, the developer will be using the most appropriate method for their crop, for their product, but we just have to analyze it with respect to the safety issues. So when I ask for the description of the genetic modification, I will ask for what is the specific method which has been used, then description and characterization of all genetic material used to modify. And that may be, you know, sometimes these promoters are from a virus or microbe or maybe synthesized, but information on all this is very much required as part of the dossier. Details of the modifications to be introduced, intermediate and recipient genetic material. So, I mean, all these requirements are very nicely explained in the guidelines. I am already running late and I won't take too much time, but this is what I just want to say, that we have to evaluate the DNA inserted into the genome, and that is the molecular characterization. And transformation cassette will have a known sequence. We should try to see that there is no plasmid backbone. Single insert intact DNA is ideal. The ideal situation is that there is no direct interruption of the endogenous gene. But even if it is there, it is okay, and we can check what is the function, growth, and composition. Many of the approved GMOs so far have more than one insert. Some are partial, and the function is the most important. Analyze the insert and look for possible fusion proteins if they are there. The techniques which are used to define these inserts, when you look at the dossier, you will have Southern blots and the PCRs to verify the sequence and evaluate the flanking sequences. All this information will be provided by the developer, which you have to look at. The next important thing is the gene stability. The gene stability is measured over multiple generations, at least 3, but most often many jurisdictions they ask for 5, 6, even developers go up to 6 to 8 or maybe more than that to evaluate any potential changes in the gene structure, possibility of adding fusion proteins or losing genes. Southern blots and PCR are again used to evaluate the stability. In addition to that, the function, how this gene, for which this gene has been inserted, is also looked at. So tomorrow we will also discuss about the information requirements, but for each genetic element, the information has to be given along with the citations from where this sequence was isolated and characterized, map and size, location, order and orientation, function of the genetic element, and source of the inserted element. As the risk assessors, you don't need to be worried so much because all this is a very routine work for the molecular biologist, and now the things have been very, very nicely standardized. So this is what I was saying: promoter, terminator, enhancer, transit and signal peptides. There may be many, interventions and different ways. So here again, Bacillus thuringiensis, for example, I just picked up an example, Criven AB gene. It had a modification of the Criven AB gene isolated from this. Sometimes the developer would have modified a little bit, but no problem. Even mosaic virus, is generally the constitutive promoter that marks the transcription to start. There might be some introns. This I picked up one particular description just to show you that this is the kind of information that you will be getting. Now this was up to the genetic level, and then we will have the expressed product. So we will have to see what is the protein being expressed, and Dr. Shashikaran will also explain you that for many of the proteins, many times it is not possible to get it into the get the this one from the crop itself, but we have to produce it in a surrogate host. So whatever you are trying to do through the expression, we must verify the functional and biochemical equivalence by the source and the protein produced by the GM crop. Whether there are any chimeras, no differences in the molecular docking sites, etc. Establish levels of expressions in the various parts. This is very, very important. You have inserted a gene. What is your promoter? It might be a constitutive promoter or a site-specific promoter, and then you have to verify what is the level of expression in various parts, and also what is the variability of expression in the host and prediction of the dose range. All this data has to be given. Patterns of expression are very relevant, and like what all questions I raised, these are the questions which are this one. So we have to, at the end of it, we have to confirm that protein expressed is intended, is in the form that was intended. I have picked up Cry-Vanaceae protein and like this, and which is effective against the insect. So I need to get the same product. If there is no same product, and if it's functionally incompetent or not enough competent, then I have to look at another event. That event has to be discarded. So like these are the kind of tables which are there, and many times the concentrations of these proteins in the plant parts are very, very low. So this is what, this is different lines of the maize. I picked up from this slide from a presentation, and this is what in the maize and this is in the cotton, and different cry genes. If you see, the concentration is how much? Micrograms per gram. And this is what, in pollen it is not detectable in most cases. In roots it's more not detectable. Seed it is there, and the leaf it is there. So like that, we need to get all this information from the developer. So sometimes, there might be, like I said, with this levels, if I have to do toxicity study or if I have to do allergenicity, where I need large amount of protein, it is not possible to get that through the extraction from the plant. So what we do is we use alternative expression systems. There is a data from the protein produced by a plant and protein expressed in an alternative expression system is compared. And then the studies demonstrate that physicochemical and functional equivalence is there, and then that protein is used for the various safety studies, which would be now explained by Sir. He will be explaining you subsequent to this molecular characterization how we proceed to do the assessment of the possible toxicity, and then allergenicity. I will deal with that. Thank you very much. I think this may look a little new to you, but when you are practicing it, it is not very difficult, and I'm sure and also one thing very important to notice, the safety assessment team, has to be consisting of people with multiple discipline. As Dr. Shashikaran said yesterday, there is no single test to evaluate. There is no single expert who can say this is safe or not safe. So it has to be multiple disciplines. Like this part will be very effectively dealt with by molecular biologists, and then we will move on to the people who are familiar with the toxicology. Thank you very much, and over to you, sir, for the next presentation on toxicity.
Thank you, Dr. Vibha. Let me share the slides. So are you able to hear me and see the slides?
And
Okay. So now we'll continue from where Dr. Vibha left in how do you go about doing the toxicity studies. Now the issue of concern why we need to do the toxicity study itself is because when you insert a gene, it ultimately expresses in the form of a protein. And the protein may not have been ever consumed by humans or animals, and nor is the protein characterized as a safe protein, what is called as a GRAS status. There could also be a chimeric protein, which is partly of the native protein and partly is another protein, which again would never have been consumed by us. And therefore, we do not know whether it is safe or not. Another possibility, of course, is that when they insert a gene, it may disturb some other metabolic pathways and may alter the concentration of some of the already existing anti-nutrients or already existing toxins in the non-modified plant itself. And that also becomes a safety issue. And that information we'll anyway get through the compositional equivalent studies. And if there is going to be a hyper expression of any of the toxins, then we have to do further safety studies. So the need for toxicological studies is therefore due to the insertion of a new protein into the plant. Now, normally proteins are safe because a protein is basically a macronutrient. The reason why proteins are safe when they are consumed, that is oral ingestion of a protein, is they get digested. Proteins don't enter the system as such. They get digested in the gastrointestinal tract, either as peptides, into peptides or into amino acids. And therefore, the original protein structure gets destroyed by in the process of digestion. There are very few proteins which go intact. Like, for example, the egg albumin is one such protein. And proteins do get into the system during infancy, when children, during the first few weeks after birth, then whole proteins are known to get into the system. But beyond that stage, due to the mucosal barrier, only the amino acids can enter into the system. And therefore, protein as such causing a toxicity is unlikely. However, proteins can cause allergy, which will be explained later. Some proteins, of course, can be actually cause toxic effects, and you can have the information about which are the protein toxins which are there in nature. And most of them, as I mentioned, are digestible, but there could be a few protein toxins which resist digestion and therefore cause symptoms, but most of the symptoms will be confined to the gastrointestinal tract. And proteins, however, are very highly active, which means even in low doses, they can cause their action. Example, if you see enzymes, they are present in small microgram quantities and still they are active. They're also highly specific because most often they bind to a specific receptor. The example of that is the Cry1AC protein. If you see the Cry1AC protein binds to a receptor in the intestines of only one particular type of a insect, which is the Helicoverpa or the Lepidopteran insect. No other insect will get affected because they don't have the receptor. That is how specific proteins are. Another interesting thing about proteins is proteins don't have cumulative toxic effect, in the sense that, like chemical substances, they don't accumulate in the body and then at some stage cause a toxic effect. As mentioned earlier, that's the reason is they get digested the moment we eat them. However, if proteins do produce an acute effect, those happen within minutes or within hours. Now, some of the protein toxins, for example, are you have ricin. Ricin is a toxin which is present in the castor bean plant. It is said that even 2 castor seeds, if they are chewed, can be toxic to the person who's consuming it. Botulinum toxin, for example, is a protein produced by Clostridium botulinum bacteria. These will paralyze the muscles. And interestingly, this particular function is now being used in cosmetology. If, for example, old people like me want to get rid of the facial wrinkles we can inject this botulinum toxin into the facial muscles and paralyze some of the muscles, and thereby the wrinkles will disappear. Other toxins, of course, are like diphtheria toxin, Staphylococcus enterotoxin, are all proteins which can cause very fatal effect on the person who is consuming it. So if toxicity testing of a protein is considered necessary, we need to do only the acute exposure study. So you give the animal a large amount of the protein which is being produced by the inserted gene and see what happens to the animal. And if that is not going to cause any effect, then you can rest assured that consuming the food which has such a protein is less likely to cause any kind of safety issue. Now, dietary proteins are not normally considered as mutagen. Another issue is, do we have to look for mutation effect of proteins? Do we have to look for a potential for them to cause developmental abnormalities or teratogenicity? Do we have to look for them as a risk for development of cancer? The reason is no. The simple reason that these proteins can't enter into a cell as such, and they cannot then go and bind to the DNA and cause any genotoxic effect or mutations, nor do they accumulate and therefore they don't cause chronic toxicity, nor do they get into the reproductive system and cause any kind of reproductive toxicity. So therefore, things like multi-generation studies, mutagenesis studies, and carcinogenicity studies are not required for any of these novel proteins. Now, as mentioned earlier, we have to put several evidences together to show that the inserted protein and thereby the genetically modified plant is safe. And we also have to look at whether these proteins get easily digested in the stomach or not. And if they don't, then it's a question of more concern for allergy than for any toxicity. And how much of the protein is present in the food which we eat, and how much of food which we eat, and therefore you have to calculate how much of the toxic protein we are likely to eat. So these are the ways by which you can do. And the acute oral toxicity study forms the basic fulcrum for establishing the safety of the new protein. So you need to have the basic information about the inserted gene and the protein which produces, the amino acid structure of the protein, and the resemblance of the protein to anything which is already known as a harmful substance in the databases. We also need to know whether this protein expression in the plant will keep changing depending upon where you grow the plant, the agroclimatic condition, or in the stages of development. Sometimes the proteins are expressed in the mature plant, and sometimes they are expressed in the immature plant, and also the part of the plant. They may be present in the root but not in the fruit, and if we consume only the fruit, then there is no reason for us to worry about the toxic effect of the protein. We also need to know that if these proteins or their digested products have any specific effect on any specific subpopulations like children or pregnant women, which is very remote situation. And how much of the edible portion you need to consume to get that large amount of protein is another issue. As I mentioned yesterday itself, if a toxic level of a protein is going to be only when you consume 1 to 1.5 kilograms of a particular food, which will never happen, and therefore the possibility are very remote. So they also need to see whether there are any other genes from the donor organism which is likely to act as piggyback on this inserted gene and then cause an effect. So let us say, for example, you're inserting a soy isoflavone gene into a banana plant, because isoflavones, have got certain health advantages. So for that purpose, you insert into a banana plant, but you should also realize that the soy plant also has got a trypsin inhibitor gene. Now, if along with the isoflavone gene, if the trypsin inhibitor gene also comes inside, in the soy, it doesn't matter because you anyway process the soya and the trypsin inhibitor disappears. But if the trypsin inhibitor is present in a banana, which we normally eat as such, it can create problems. So such as hypothetical situations are also possible. And as was mentioned, if such a situation arises, we have to design the toxicity studies in a different manner on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the inserted gene may produce a substance which we are anyway consuming from other source. Again, a hypothetical situation. If I want to insert a omega-3 fatty acid gene from an algal source into the sunflower seed. Sunflower oil, you know, is rich in omega-6 but poor in omega-3. So in order to produce an oil which has got omega-3 and omega-6, if I were to insert a gene, will we do any toxic studies? There will be no requirement because we anyway consume omega-3 through fish and other omega-3 sources, and therefore what is introduced it may be different to the sunflower, but it is already consumed in some form or the other. And again, depends upon which part of the plant we are consuming. If the toxic protein is present in the root, but we are actually eating the fruit, then again, there will be no cause of concern. Now, if we have to produce this, do a toxicity study, we have to give the animal a lot of protein. And that amount of protein may not be expressed in the plant. And therefore, we have to produce the protein through an alternate method. So what they do is they take the same gene and put it inside a expression system like E. coli or an yeast and ferment it. When they ferment it, they get a large amount of protein, and that protein can be purified. So you can get a purified protein which is equivalent to sometimes 10 kilos or 100 kilos of the particular food. And extracting it from that amount of food is technically not feasible, and therefore this is acceptable. The only thing you have to make sure is, did the protein I produce from the bacteria have the same effect like the protein which is present in the food? For example, if Cry1AC in a brinjal kills a worm, Helicoverpa worm, will this protein produced in bacteria also kill the worm? We have to make sure of that. So what we do is, such a protein is first sprayed on the plant, and then they put the worms on top of it to see whether the worms die. Only when the artificially expressed protein produces the same insect killing property like the protein which is present inside the plant, then only you can go ahead and do the acute toxicity study. You have to establish what is called the structural as well as the functional equivalence to the native protein. And you can also get toxicological data from literature, from in vitro studies. For example, you want to know it is stable to heat, you can do in vitro studies. You can also get from bioinformatics sources. And armed with all this information, you can plan an animal study. And the proteins will, you can give as much as equivalent to 10 times, 100 times, and even 1,000 times as much as what is present inside the plant. You can keep on going to higher and higher doses. Generally, they say the maximum hazard dose can be over 1,000 to 10,000 times as expressed in the plant. If it's present in the plant in microgram quantities, you can produce them in gram quantities, and you can give that to an animal through a single dose or through a divided dose. You force it into the rat stomach through a gavage, the pure protein, and then see what happens to the animal after a 2-week observation period. And meanwhile, you observe the animal for any loss in body weight, whether it eats food consumption, whether it is moving about normally or not. And at the end of 14 days, you sacrifice the animal, look at the organ weight, look at the histopathology, and also do a detailed biochemistry to make sure. And you will always have a control set of animals where you don't give the protein, but you just sham provide some other protein which is naturally safer. And conventional toxicological tests, as I mentioned in yesterday's presentation, for what we do for chemicals like pesticides, you cannot apply it here. And here, it is only to see that when I give it in these large quantities, if the animal is safe, then we can be assured that if people were to eat the plant material as much as they want, it will never cause any kind of a harmful effect. And if you need to feed the actual plant material to the animal, sometimes it may be necessary, especially if you think it has undergone, you want to know whether it has any nutritional effect. Then a 90-day rat study can be done where you feed the animal, let us say, a dehydrated and powdered form of the particular fruit, for example, brinjal, to the animal along with the diet, without disturbing the nutritional composition of the animal feed and just observe the animal for 90 days, which is not always required. If there are any additional studies, for example, some people have suggested you can feed them to chicken, broiler chicken, and as far as poultry feed, and you can examine them for their any safety issues, etc. But generally, these kind of animal studies are not required unless there is a part of the modified plant is also being used as animal feed. Let's say it's used as poultry feed or a cattle feed. Then what you can do is you can use that particular material to the animal. You don't have to sacrifice these large animals. You only look for their growth and their reproduction, and as also, if example it is for cattle, the milk produced, etc. And thereby to make sure that feeding the animals is also safe. In fact, yesterday, Dr. Pereira asked this question about veterinary, about feed. So if this part of the plant is going as a feed also, you can feed it to these animals and do a safety assessment studies. And when a protein demonstrates no acute oral toxicity, that means it is not only safe for humans, that is, it is not only safe for the rat, it is also safe for the humans, it is also safe for all other species which may consume some part of this plant or the other. And I also already mentioned that mutagenicity, teratogenicity, and carcinogenicity studies are not applicable for protein molecules. Sometimes if genetic modification produce a non-protein substance, which may be much smaller molecule, then you may have to design the toxicity studies in an entirely different manner, and that again would depend upon a case-by-case basis. In which case you can also do the metabolic studies, you can do the toxicokinetics, you can do chronic toxicity or carcinogenicity like for a small molecule if it's a non-protein substance produced by the genetic modification. Then now new proteins with a history of safe consumption, as I mentioned earlier, there's no need to worry. And only when it is new protein is not consumed ever before, so you have to do the acute toxicity. If there are minor amino acid sequence modification in an already known non-toxic proteins, these kind of toxicity studies are not required if the changes are only very small. And you also have to do it on crops of several generations to make sure the expression of the novel protein is still at the same level and does not keep going up. And so that is the gist of the toxicological studies you do and the kind of the procedures which are required. They are really not very difficult to do, but when you look, you need to look at the data which is submitted by the developers, whether they did these studies in a meticulous manner, and you must therefore have a proper checklist, and with the help of a checklist you can see whether all the data is available. Thank you very much. Let me unshare it.
So
stop sharing.
Yes, sir. Sir, it has stopped. So, Dr. Gauri, if there are any questions or you want discussion in between, we can have some discussion if there are any questions.
Dr. Vibha, we can ask the participants to ask the questions at the end, no?
Okay. No, I thought that we are just one after the other making presentations.
No, what they can do is, as the presentations are going on, the participants can post their questions in the chat box, and one of you there in Sri Lanka can put them all together, and then one person can ask us the questions at the end.
Okay, we can ask the participants, we can request the participants to put the questions in the chat box, sir.
Yes.
Okay,
then you put them all together. Sometimes many people may ask the same question, so then you can pool them together and ask us at the end of the presentations.
Okay, Dr.
So moving on from where Dr. Shashikaran completed about the toxicity study, another important concern which is commonly raised and is, for regarding the GM crops is the assessing the potential allergenicity. Now this also becomes important, as sir said, because as we heard, that there might be novel proteins which have not been in the food chain. So we really don't know, they might cause any allergenicity, and that is why the assessment of this potential allergenicity is very important. Again, another important thing to remember is case by case. There might be some protein which we have inserted from one organism to another, but that has been in the use as food use. It has a history of safe use. Then we don't have to do all this. I'll give you an example of like beta carotene. We read about I showed a slide about the golden rice. So the golden rice has the beta carotene, which is not allergenic. We know that. So in that case, this kind of studies will not be applicable. So it has to be very, very clear that these studies are again case by case studies. And also there are genetically modified or genetically engineered crops where some gene silencing has happened, something has been removed, so there is probably no expressed protein. So all this is the science which relates to when a novel protein is expressed by your genetic intervention. So now to understand the allergenicity assessment process, we because many of us medical background. So what we've done is think what exactly is allergy? Somebody is mute. What are the risks of allergy, the characteristics of the allergen, and methods that are used to identify, these allergic proteins? This is what we are going to understand a little bit here. So what is food allergy? Now allergy again, the focus is to be on food safety. So we are going to talk about food allergy. So food allergy is actually an adverse immune reaction to, it may be a normally safe dietary protein. You see, everybody doesn't have a food allergy. There might be within us somebody who has a peanut is very safe for me, but peanut, there are people with allergy to peanut. So it is not that that particular protein is unsafe and that is why it is causing allergy. It is the immune reaction by the specific individuals to some proteins that can cause allergy. So it might be a very normal safe dietary protein like eggs. We keep hearing people have allergy to fish, to eggs or peanut and like that, So basically food allergy also is two types, and you have to also differentiate between non-immune food intolerance and the immune system based allergy. So what we are talking of is the food allergy, which is the IgE mediated, and it can be IgE mediated or non-IgE mediated. Now IgE mediated is like spontaneous, whereas non-IgE mediated is over time, like celiac disease and the other non-IgE mediated diseases. So to give you an explanation, it is an adverse reaction to an otherwise harmless food or food component that involves an abnormal response of the body's immune system. IgE mediated responses, which are immediate reactions, hypersensitivity responses, they will be usually within minutes or few hours after the ingestion. Then there will be non-IgE mediated immune reactions through other immunoglobulins or cell mediated. These are like cow's milk, eggs, soy, celiac disease, etc. And in these cases, the symptoms occur 8 hours after the ingestion. So this is again the type of symptoms which are there. In IgE mediated, there will be an anaphylactic shock, gastrointestinal disorders, urticaria, diarrhea, etc. And in cell mediated, there might be problems with the small intestine, again bone pain, malabsorption, and so on and so forth. So what are the major allergenic sources? Foods, among the foods, there are peanut, tree nut, cow milk, chicken, egg, crustaceans, and sometimes wheat and soybean to some people, sesame, celery root, mustard. These are all very known allergens, non-allergenic food, allergenic foods. There are also allergens which are through airway, like pollens, molds, insects, latex, and then injection like bee and wasp stinging venoms. But we are going to focus on our discussion only on food allergens. There are about 170 foods, more than 170 foods which can cause food allergy in some people. But out of that, only 8 are responsible for more than 90% of the allergic reactions. And these are cow's milk, eggs, fish, crustaceans, peanut, soybean, nuts, and wheat. So out of these 8 also, the more common is peanut and soybean, which is quite common, and maize is not known to cause much of the allergenic reaction. The prevalence also varies a lot, and I would say here that I have taken these slides from a very well-known allergy expert who is Dr. Richard Goodman. He has worked with all of us in India, and when he used to always say that when you say that the prevalence of allergenic reactions in India or in South Asia is limited, because there is not enough testing done for that. There's not enough reporting for that. And he will always say that in developed countries, the prevalence appears to be more because of the more reporting, this thing. We don't have the data for all this, but this is just to share with you the concept of allergenicity. So now coming to the properties of allergens, virtually all allergens are proteins, but not all proteins are food allergens. So here, because you are inserting a gene and it is going to express a protein, that's how this concept of allergenicity comes into being. The food contains tens of thousands of proteins. Like sir also explained about the common dietary proteins, which are like macronutrients, but there are very few which are allergens. Most allergens are stable to digestion and processing. So now these are very important to understand. They are stable to digestion and processing, and that's why they are able to, when sir showed you the slide on dietary proteins, he said most of these proteins are safe because they are broken into peptides, and that's why they are, there is no toxic or this kind of effect. But if there is any protein which is stable to digestion, then it might be an allergen. So most allergens have been shown to be stable to digestion, and this will form the basis of our testing the allergenicity. Most allergens tend to be abundant proteins. Many but not all food allergens have been cloned and characterized. Now coming to the GM crops, this was basically the concept of allergenicity. But when we are talking about the assessment of allergenicity potential of GM crops, what is the rationale? The rationale is that if I am introducing a new protein, then it should not, increase the risk of allergy in that particular. I will give you an example later how it is important in that particular crop. So this is to prevent avoidable increase in the risk of allergy while transferring novel gene proteins into food crops, and to ensure that risks are not greater than risks from the non-transgenic varieties. So one thing to remember is that, many times people say that, oh, GM food, this particular protein, when it was put into GM food, it became allergic. It's not like that. The protein remains as it is. But if I've taken a protein, let's say from peanut, so that protein could make my soybean allergenic. Which means it won't be allergenic again to all. Those who were allergic to peanut will be allergic to soybean then. It is not that suddenly the GM food becomes allergenic to everyone. So this is something which we have to understand. It is the source, now you have to relate the whole concept of the safety assessment. The history of safety, I told you that we are trying to understand what is my donor. So is my donor has any properties of allergenicity? If so, then I'll be checking that protein before putting into another crop that am I adding any allergen to my GM crop? So this is very important. But then there will be novel proteins like the protein Cry1 AC, which was not in our food chain. At that time, again, I have to test the allergenicity. So we evaluate the possibility that introduced protein is an allergen. So how do we do that? We do it through source and the sequence of that allergen. Because all allergen, if you see my previous slide, all have been cloned and characterized. So sequences are all information is available. Possibility of cross reactivity, source and sequence, then characteristics of proteins compared to the known food allergens. This will be stability and abundance. So all these three are important. There is no single test which can predict food allergy for humans, and so we go for a weight of evidence approach, which sir explained you yesterday. The same approach would be used here. So the weight of evidence approach will go how? We will first check whether the protein of the imported gene encodes an existing allergen, whether it is similar to any existing allergen. And how this would be done? This would be done through research and also through bioinformatics. Bioinformatics, we all know some of you. There is some noise coming. Somebody has to mute. Yeah. So literature search and bioinformatics through the databases which are available for allergens, which I will inform you later. Is the protein sufficiently similar to an allergen to produce allergic cross reactions? It is not encoding an allergen, but is the sequence similar to any known allergen? That also we do through bioinformatics, because the allergenicity is based on of a specific protein is because of its constitution and the the multidimensional structure. So sequence similarity is my basis. Is the new protein likely to sensitize and become an allergen? Which means that is it stable in pepsin? Is it stable to heating? All these kind of characters which are the characteristics of the allergens, that also we will test. And then of course we will also see that if that particular crop or my host itself has allergenicity, is this insertion of the gene increasing the endogenous allergenicity? So for doing this, allergenicity is a very complex subject because there is no single test which can do, and also, there are no animal models or things like that the way we do toxicity, because allergenicity is in very few individuals. So leave aside animals, even within humans, I don't know where to test. So that's why these are the weight of evidence approach which is used. There was a lot of discussion on that since almost 1992. And then all these discussions, there were decision trees made, and weight of evidence approach has been finally agreed in the 2003 Codex guidelines, and the same approach we have adopted. We are not going to discuss this in detail, but I just wanted to mention, even yesterday sir mentioned that a decade of consultation also included an organization called International Life Sciences Institute, which did a lot of work on allergenicity. And finally, they came up with this kind of a decision tree. Even in the weight of evidence approach, you have to keep saying yes, no, keeps ruling out things, and then finally you reach to the decision. So if you look at it, source of the gene, what is important? Then this is solid phase immunoassay, sequence similarity, stability to digestion, consult with the regulatory. This is how they had made a decision tree, which formed the basis of inclusion in our guidelines. But coming to the practical thing, like I mentioned in my first presentation, that as the risk assessors and evaluators, we need to know all this. But then in terms of functionality, it comes to what is the information that I should be asking. So we ask for the source of the gene, and that provides me information if it is allergenic and what is the evidence of IgE mediated allergy. Amino acid sequence similarity, which I just mentioned with known allergens. So more than 35% identity in the window of 80 amino acids is considered to be an alert. And then you have to do further studies. Contiguous epitope size should be scientifically justifiable. Pepsin resistance is very important. This is strongly recommended. This is the in vitro test where we see whether it can digest the way sir explained you, or is it resistant to the pepsin digestion. In fact, there are many digestive models, but pepsin resistance is the most commonly used. on a case-by-case basis. The first three, along with the heat stability, actually, these are most important, which are the basic information. If all three is a negative, generally it is ruled out that it can be the allergens. And that's how the decisions have been taken by all regulatory authorities. Specific serum screening is done when, if the allergic source or the sequence homology with allergens, these all come secondary. If you have any doubt on the above three, then you do this. And if there are still, if the protein is from the allergenic source, then sometimes the additional studies may be done, like skin prick test and all. But let me tell you, nothing has proceeded to this level. In all the approved products so far, it is the first three where it was, negative, and then there has never been a single case of any allergenicity from a GM crop so far. So these testing procedures are adequate and they give you enough information on whether this should be approved or not. And then of course there will be absolute exposure to the novel protein and things like that, So like I said, this is going to be my assessment strategy. This is just a summary of that. And then at the end, with what I just now said, totality of assessments, that is the weight of evidence, provides reasonable assurance that foods will not be rendered newly allergenic. Now, this is a very common example which is quoted everywhere by the activist organizations or, various people, that, the Brazil nut allergenicity happened in soybean. So I thought I will just discuss with you this case. You see, Brazil nut it is like our groundnut, another, kind of nut which is grown there. And like peanut, it also has allergens in it. Allergens to some people. So one of the genes, which is 2S-methionine rich albumin, it was transferred from the Brazil nut to soybean as a means of enhancing poultry feed. So this was an experiment. This was only in the lab. Now 2S-albumin, this particular protein which was transferred, is a major Brazil nut allergen. So that information was available from the literature. Now the thing is that, suppose I am a patient, I am a person who is, allergic to Brazil nut. So, but I am not allergic to soybean. And if this gene has come and it starts creating allergenicity in soybean, then the people who will label it, they will not label soybean. Brazil nut is always any product from like peanut, it is labeled that it has any product, it is mandatory even here in India, everywhere, that if you have any product which has peanut, it should be labeled so that people who know that I am allergic to peanut, they don't consume it. But if the gene is there in, the soybean may not be labeled. So unknowingly people will consume that, and then it can cause problems to them. So it is not that this became allergic in soybean. This was already an allergen, a known allergen, but they were trying to transfer it to the soybean for enhancing poultry feed. And thereby they were anticipating that allergic response might happen. And that's why the transgenic soybean extract was tested on patients allergic to Brazil nuts during the development phase of the project. Please remember, development phase of the project. So what they found was that it was causing the allergenicity. So when it was causing the allergenicity, this is the transgenic soybean extract and this is the Brazil nut extract. So both of them caused this was very much, predicted that this might happen. So because of that, this project was shelved. No further research happened. And why it was done? Because it was one of the regulatory requirements. So see the robustness of the guidelines and the regulatory system. Such product was stopped there and then. So any misinformation about this particular product is being spread by some organizations that this gene was transferred and so all GM foods are allergic. So that is something we as assessors have to look at. This is not something which has ever come to the market. It was only a laboratory experiment, and they were required to do this test, and that's why they had to stop this project. Now, the other thing which is important is the bioinformatics protocol. In the bioinformatics protocol, you have to select a good allergen specific database. There are many databases available which are specific to which contain a lot of information on the allergens. We have to make our search strategy and criteria for cross reactivity, which will be like 35% sequence, more than 35% in a window of 80 amino acids. So this kind of search strategy has to be put. You have to have the sequence of your protein, and then you can do the bioinformatics assay. There are lots of databases on this. This is just a list which has been provided by Dr. Goodman only, but then this is the database which is most commonly used by people. This is called Allergen Online database. This is by from the same place where Dr. Goodman belongs, that is University of Nebraska. It is a curated database. It won't have just a list, but what is the sequence, complete detail, curated to include only allergens with the published proof of allergenicity. The use is free, and there is no registration requirements, and one can look at. The third important thing which we said, one was the source of the gene. The second was bioinformatics, and the third most important is stability to pepsin digestion. So this is how it is done. Stability, resistance to a protein to digest and retain structural integrity and increase probability. This is again a part of the weight of evidence approach. It's a very simple in vitro correlative test. Very routinely it was done in the institute which Dr. Shashikaran was heading. They have all got expertise in that, and it can be done. Assay validated in multi-laboratory evaluation can, first of all, even whenever you are doing a test for the regulatory purpose, it's very important to validate. So the same protein can be done in multi-laboratory evaluation against a set of common this one. So this is what the pepsin digestibility is. So these are egg allergens, these are soybean allergens, these are mustard allergens, and so on. And within minutes, how many minutes does it? 60 minutes, it remains stable. Ovomucoid 8 minutes. So like that, So when the Cry1AC protein was tested in the pepsin digestion, how many minutes did it was stable? Less than a minute. So even after 45 seconds, 30 seconds, and 1 minute, all were tested. It was like degraded. So we know that it cannot be an allergen. So the safety of Cry1AC protein was also tested using all these three things. It did not have the Bacillus thuringiensis is not known to cause allergen. I mean, of course, it was not known as a food chain, but any other kind of allergenicity was not there. There was no reports of anything. Heat stability, it was not heat, it was heat lay-by. In less than 1 minute, it is, not intact. And similarly, in pepsin digestibility, less than a minute. After that, no Cry1AC could be intact. Cry1AC could be detected. There were peptides in that. So that's how we did. These are common proteins. So it's here shown here also. Cry1A 0.5, 30 seconds. Cry2 less than 15 seconds, like that. These are the most commonly used so far, insect resistance and herbicide tolerant traits. So there is no question of the already approved GM foods being allergic. There is no question of that, because these transgenic proteins were not at all allergenic. If necessary, then you have to do some specialized tests, which is like serum IgE tests and so on, where there is a requirement for a allergic sera. And also the animal models, sometimes people say that if you are testing toxicity in animals, why don't we do allergenicity in animals? There is no non-human animal model which has proven predictive of human allergy for more than a few proteins, and hence we cannot use animal models for human allergy. This would be helpful definitely, but then there is nothing like that already available. So to conclude about allergenicity, GM foods that are to be commercialized should be assessed for allergenicity, except when there is a history of safe consumption. When it is a history of safe consumption, you do not need to do allogenicity at all. Considering the source, amino acid sequence homology and pepsin digestibility are the basic tools. Serum screening may not be warranted in most cases, but that is the advanced tool. Further studies are needed to determine thresholds, if any, for sensitization. In the future, animal models may be a valuable tool, but currently there is no animal model to study the allogenicity, and all the information is based on these 3 tests. Thank you very much. I think this gave you enough information about allogenicity, but what I'm going to do tomorrow is also share a few more resources. So if any of you is interested in knowing more about allogenicity, toxicity, or any of this information, you can always look for those resources and understand more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vibha. You come up, yes. So can you see the slides and hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now this is the last presentation for the day. And this is regarding the compositional equivalence to establish the absence of any unintended effects. Now the adverse effects of a GM crop could be because of the inserted gene, which was already discussed so far, but it could also be an indirect effect because the inserted gene could possibly alter the expression of some other genes, and which may result in certain compositional changes in the modified plant relative to the unmodified one. Now you should remember that even in an unmodified plant, that is the natural plants which we have, no 2 plants will have similar composition. There will always be a variation, and that variation could depend upon the variety of the plant. It could depend upon the climate in which it is grown, the growth condition, the way they are stored, etc. I will tell you one small story here. There is a story that in a big field, there was a banyan tree onto one corner of the field. So during the day, when there is sunlight in most of the field, that part of the field which was near the banyan tree was half the day used to have only shade. So when they analyzed the composition of the plants which were near the banyan tree versus those which were in the bright sunlight, there was a significant difference in the composition. So what I'm trying to say out of this is that normal plants also will have a variety of variations in the expression of the same substance. So when we compare a genetically modified plant with its normal counterpart or the natural counterpart, we should know that the variation could occur and that they will not be identical. Okay. So we should also remember that sometimes the genetic modification may alter the nutritional value of the particular plant. And let us say that we do the genetic modification of a carrot plant, and if it could alter the beta carotene expression. So there is all these potential possibilities which we call as the unintended effect. That is not the reason for that. Plants naturally also have a lot of toxins and anti-nutrients. For example, you see the crops, even in this table on the left, you have the rapeseed in which you got erucic acid, phytates. In maize, you have phytates, and tomatoes, you've got solanine. In potatoes, also you can have solanine and protease inhibitors, and you know all the inhibitors in the soya. So even the plants which we are eating on a day-to-day basis, which are not genetically modified, also have a whole lot of negative substances, and that will have to also be compared and measured between the genetically modified versus the natural ones. So the purpose and principle, therefore, of doing a composition analysis is to identify whether any of the components of the plant have been unintentionally modified. So the methods you need to use is you have to look at all the key nutrients, anti-nutrient, toxins, bioactive molecules in that natural plant, which are measurable and where methods are available, and compare all these with the genetically modified plant and see what are the differences. And we also look at several toxins which are naturally present and see whether the toxin expressions are the same, more, or they are less, and if so, what is the extent or difference. Now, when you do a field trial, you have to locate the trial sites in different environmental conditions. India being a huge country, we have several agroclimatic zones. I'm not very sure that whether Sri Lanka being a small country has that many differences. And therefore, you may have less agroclimatic, but in each agroclimatic zone, you must have certain multiple trial sites so that you capture the variations which are associated with those differences. Soil differences also may exist from region to region, and this will also alter the composition of the crop. So we have to be mindful of the soil characteristics as well. And trials have to be conducted on sufficient generation of the plant. What happens is sometimes in a modified plant in the F1, F2 generations, you may not see a change, but in the subsequent generation, there may be certain changes observed. So that also has to be captured. And each trial site is required to be replicated to establish the seasonal effects. Like in India, we have got the Kharif season and the Rabi season. So that is related to the monsoon season and the post-monsoon season. And I'm sure you have the same kind of seasons in Sri Lanka also. And you have to now capture the effect of the seasons also on the variations. And sampling of adequate number of plants. As I mentioned, in a field, you must sample the plants in different corners of the field, in the center of the field. There are sampling formats or matrix according to which the plant should be sampled from different parts of the same field to see the intra-field variations. And you will be also growing the unmodified plant also side by side so that you get the minimum amount of variations. And consideration should also be given to whether the introduced trait is likely to result in changes in the consumption pattern. Another thing is when you have compositional changes occurring, you should also realize that this alters the nutritional status of the particular crop. And when that change is going to be a major one, then you have to see whether it is adequate for certain specialized group where nutrient requirements may be more. Now, what all you should test for? You should look at the moisture, the ash, the protein, fat, carbohydrate, fiber, amino acid composition, fatty acid composition, the vitamins present, the minerals present, all the anti-nutrients like phytate, trypsin inhibitors, lectins, galactosides, and certain other secondary metabolites, and even some biologically active molecules which may be naturally present in these plants. And another important aspect is you must have validated methods. The method should have been well tested, its limit of quantification and limit of detection and the sensitivity, specificity, all should be worked out. You must also have, the developer should also have external validation. That means he should send samples to another lab to make sure his lab is working well. There should be a reference standards, and the methods are very, very important. Otherwise, the methodological variations itself may be so much that you will not be able to capture the subtle changes which might have taken place because of the genetic manipulation. And then you also, if you do find any change, let us say there's an increase in a particular nutrient. Now, is that significantly different? Is it within the normal variations? Even if it's beyond the variation, let us say it is abnormally high or an abnormally low, will it make a difference to the consumer? Will it make any kind of a health hazard? So that is the kind of considerations over and above the compositional equivalence one should look into. If these are going to be used as livestock feeds, then you have to see whether this change in composition will affect the growth of the livestock. For example, if it is used as cattle feed, will it alter the milk output? So those kind of considerations are to be seen on a case-by-case basis after the establishment of the compositional differences. Generally, the analytical methods are by the AOAC methods, or the Association of Analytical Chemists methods, and these are the well-standardized, validated methods, and they should be done under good laboratory practices conditions, which is a OECD regulatory accreditation. And for less common test compounds, for example, those which are present in small quantities, if you need to develop a new method, you can still do that, but see that the method is validated and you have an external validation facility also. If you need reference data, if you don't have enough, there are a whole lot of OECD documents which give the reference data on the whole range of varieties which exist on the earth for corn, soybean, rice, etc. And if you see an abnormal change in a particular nutrient, you can go to these databases and see whether there are any varieties or variants which are already consumed by the human populations, which also have that kind of a level of expression. You also have the ILSI crop composition database for corn, soybean, and cotton. And of course, scientific literature always has got a lot of publications which you can refer to if you see any abnormal change in the composition. So some minor crops you may have insufficient data. Sometimes you may have to generate the data on the commercial varieties which are present within your country, because there may be some varieties which are very native to your country. You need to know the data on that. If you do not have that, the regulators need to arrange for generating such data on the normal composition of many of these lesser known crops, which are likely to be used for genetic modification. So as I mentioned, if there are significant differences, detection of a major change due to unintended effect may preclude the marketing of the product if it is going to be of a safety issue. Otherwise, even if there is an overexpression of some particular component, if there are no safety or nutritional hazard related, you can still approve such crops. The first phase of the nutritional evaluation will be, of course, based on the nutritional composition data. And only if there are any unusual changes, you need to do any further evaluation. The safety of a major increase in the level of a nutrient or a biologically active component will need to be assessed in a similar way to the safety assessment of an intended nutritional change. In the sense that if, for example, like in golden rice, the intended nutritional change is to increase beta-carotene expression. If there's an unintended nutritional change also resulting in some nutrient overexpression, you again have to assess it more or less in the same way as you do a intended change. So intended nutritional modifications are, as I mentioned, where you intentionally insert a gene to act in such a way as to increase the expression of a nutrient so that it benefits the consumers or the population. A good example again is the golden rice. And computation of the data, you can actually compute the data and compare it with the already existing databases to see whether the compositional change is of any meaning or not. And you also need to know the consumption pattern. That's another issue, is that you must know what is the normal food intake of that particular crop in your population, what is the minimum intake, what's the maximum and average intakes, what is the recommended dietary allowances as estimated in your country for not only for adults but also for infants and children, and whether consumption of this particular kind of a food crop with either an intended or unintended change in the nutritional composition is likely to affect their average intakes, either less or more. And what is likely to be the possible health impact. So these are all the corollaries of a compositional data. And after generating the compositional data, if you do see a significant change beyond the normal variation, then you have to look at all these other public health aspects. And then, of course, what's the impact assessment? Now, if such a crop is released, will it have an impact on the health of the people who are consuming it? And geographical differences, again, as I've already mentioned, you have to capture. And in the sense that geographical difference means there may be certain populations who have a nutritional deficiencies, etc. And if you are going to provide this crop to those populations, whether this altered nutrient status is likely to affect those specialized populations in your country is another component one has to look into. Now, testing for, again, animals is, if this particular crop is also going to be used for animals, you may have to look at what does it mean in terms of the livestock growth and the livestock productivity. And if the bioavailability of a particular nutrient has also got changed because of the modification, then it becomes even more significant for doing this animal feeding studies. And foods designed for health benefits may require specific nutritional toxicological studies. Again, I'm referring to the golden rice, which is meant for a specific purpose. It is meant for children and women who are vulnerable people, to protect them against vitamin A deficiency. And therefore, the example is in the earlier version of the golden rice, the amount of beta carotene which came out of that particular was not enough to solve the problem of vitamin A deficiency. That is why golden rice 2 came into effect. So this was detected by the compositional studies which they did, and found that the modification was not adequate, and they went on to develop the second level. So that is a good example to think of. And so based on analysis of nutritional impact, the dietary needs of the populations can be calculated. And unintended effect, of course, is the result of random insertion of DNA sequences. Sometimes it may activate a gene, sometimes it may even silence a gene. So the levels of the beneficial component may come down or may go up. Both are possible. Of course, and I already mentioned that you have to take up the issue of the variations associated with the phenotypic characteristics as well as the agronomic variations. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, we'll be able to answer. In case we are not able to answer today, the questions may be posted to us, and the first thing tomorrow we will be able to answer some of these questions. Thank you very much. Now let me unshare it. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Actually, we got only one question. So that is from Ms. Delaney, FAO. Should a developer or researcher provide both basic information and safety information when submitting an application, or provide the safety information after the basic information is approved?
Dr. Vibha?
Share message.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I looked at the question. Yes, Delaney, when you are asking for any approval, final approval as food use, then you have to give both the basic information as well as the food safety assessment. Complete dossier has to be given when the approval is sought for food use. But if you are at some interim stage, then the regulator will tell you that, okay, for initiating this study, what is needed and so on. The complete is required for any release. No product is approved without all this complete information. But like we have been saying, sir also said and I also said that it is case by case. So everything may not be relevant in all cases. That's how it will work.
See, one more possibility, of course, is that since the investments are very high for the developer to generate this data, some of the developers may be a little worried whether they are doing the right thing or not. So they're at the initial stages itself, they come up with this basic data and then seek the regulator's opinion on what all tests further needs to be done, so that they are on the right path and they don't waste the money. Otherwise, they may do the whole study and then come to the regulator and say, we shouldn't have done this study. So for that safety's sake also, an early discussion may be helpful.
And also another thing is that, many of these studies may be already available. Like, for example, CRY1AC study, the CRY1AC acute toxicity study. The
Correct.
protein was purified and it was tested in the rats as acute oral toxicity study. Now that study has been conducted once. And now when this same gene is introduced in another crop, then you don't have to repeat the study. The the studies using purified protein will be used by the developer, maybe for multiple crops, multiple jurisdictions. They don't have to do these studies in every country. For example, in India, all the lab-based studies will be accepted. In all countries, it is done that. So acute oral toxicity using rats is done once, and the same report is given in multiple jurisdictions for approval. Because otherwise, the cost of doing all this will become huge, and there is no use in repeating this.
Thank you so much, Doctor. If any other participants have any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If not, please send it to the chat box.
May I come in?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Ahuja and Dr. Sasikaran gave a very extensive coverage of the food assessment. I think everything was covered. My concern is that we have to consider the way of life of people of different countries. They are unique. The way the people consume corn, for example, in Sri Lanka, is different to any other people in any other country. So, for example, the way we prepare our curries, the way we use the corn on the cob, the salads, the soups, and so on are different and unique. So I saw a slide yesterday. Somebody said that if one group, if it is safe for one group, it is safe for the other. I think I cannot accept that because the way of life we have to respect and accept that there are different ways in which people consume. I have heard people saying, I have eaten GM food for 10-15 years, nothing has happened to me. Without an atom of evidence, without any scientific basis, they come and make these statements. So I think we have to consider I think it will be considered in risk assessment. I'm sure tomorrow we will hear about it. So how do we do that? I mean, we can't make it very complicated also, like Ahuja said, and if you're going to do everything the way we consider, it's not going to be practically possible. How do we draw the line, Dr. Ahuja?
Yes. So, sir, actually, if you remember, the slides don't cover everything, but the guidelines cover everything, your guidelines. So when I talked about history of safe use, I also spoke about dietary exposure. So dietary exposure also includes the methods of processing and cooking. And that's where I said, that the history of safe use or, the information about the unconfined product is very important. So once you have the information of the unmodified product and you know that these are the ways it can be cooked, then as part of the safety assessment, the developers will provide you information on what happens to this protein if it is boiled, the food is boiled. What happens to if it is, like another way of cooking? For example, what do we say, like, whatever ways of cooking, So fried, for example, it is fried, it is boiled, or it is used, in some other treatments. So all that information, effect of processing, effect of cooking, forms a very important part of the safety assessment. And there we will see that, like, for example, I will present to you the BT Brinjal case study again tomorrow. So here you will see that when they gave the data about BT Brinjal in India, there were 4 different ways, it can be roasted, it can be fried, it can be, this thing. So whatever way you are eating, the basic processing methods will be 3, 4 or 5. So all that were taken into account, and the presence of protein. So the defined difference is CRY1AC. What happens when brinjal is fried? What happens to the protein? So they found out that less than a minute, 30 seconds, because it's a heat labile protein, it doesn't remain there in that form. So which means that, you know, whichever country it would be used in, if it is used in fried form, boiled form, or whatever ways, the results will be same. So it is not like, sir, that's what I'm saying, you know, people are very fond of saying that GM foods, this happens. We don't have to, we have to come out of that notion. It has to be every product by product, case by case, requirement by requirement, and that's how you have to look at, with that kind of a lens to the food safety, not like a general thing, sir. If you start looking at general thing, then you will always have doubts and you will not be able to have a logical risk assessment methodology. So
one more thing is that if, for example, if in Sri Lanka a corn is being used in a variety of ways, as you mentioned, and people have been consuming that for centuries, now somebody comes with a genetically modified corn, and if you compare the compositional equivalence between the corn which is traditionally used versus the modified ones, and the compositions are similar, then there should be no issue whether it is a genetically modified one or an unmodified one. Only there's a compositional difference. It's a composition.
It's not the composition. The hazard is the protein, the new protein.
Then that's what Vibha answered. That's what Vibha answered. I am talking about the other part of it. What you want, new protein, is what Dr. Vibha answered. I am also adding to it in terms of the compositional part also.
So the new protein has been added, but what is the level of that protein? It is present in, you know, less than few micrograms, you know, per gram. So that particular protein, and it has been, you know, let's say through all this safety assessment paradigm that I explained, it has been said that it is safe to consume. And that safety assessment paradigm also included, when you are making a curry or anything, you know, these are the basic processes that we do. Either we roast, we fry, we boil, or whatever, you know, 3-4 processes. And all that also have been tested. So then there won't be any variation, you know, in terms of the usage in country to country, sir. Because that protein is itself not there. In 30 seconds, it's degraded to peptides or denatured.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. If there's any other questions, please feel free to ask.
Dr. Sashikaran, I have a question. This is Shanak from FAO.
Yeah.
So now we have, like, you know, GM used in different countries, and when they do use it for the very first time, they go through this entire risk assessment, right? Now let's say this is going to be used by a new country. So based on the experience we have on GM food that we have used so far in the world, what's the level of safety being done when the same food, which is known to be, like, you know, proven, like, let's say the certain food has been used for several years by a certain country. Now this is going to be used by a new country or a new population. How much extra safety or safety assessment that is being done based on our experience with the existing GM crops, food actually?
See, whatever lot of transboundary movement is existing between different food crops, and the importing country looks at the entire data associated with that particular food crop. They either import it as such and use it as such, or they import the gene and introgress it and put it into their own native hybrids, in which case they will do all the composition studies. Otherwise, based on the data, if it has been safe for consumption in several other countries and is comparable with their corn which they have been otherwise non-GM corn or non-GM plant which they are otherwise importing, then there should be no health issues, and we have never documented any such issue in any of the countries across the world where a population specific intolerance has been existing. Allergens, yes, if there is a potential allergen, then the concern is there. Otherwise, there is no issue.
So I will just add to what sir said. You see, when you have looked at all the tests which we presented, most of these are laboratory-based testings. So laboratory-based testings, and they are in using very standardized protocols. Even the probable variation has been taken into account in the, like sir said, in compositional considerations. So all this data is generally, so far, no country repeats. The only thing is they look at review the data and they see if there's anything additional. If you feel specific to your country, you can always get back to the developer. But it is mostly in the environmental, studies where you would need country specific, data is more important there because of the cultivation reasons. Because it is to be cultivation. Food use, we are all humans, most of it is similar. It hardly makes a difference. So far, there has not been any jurisdiction, like 67 countries are using the GM crops for food and feed purpose. So for 41 whatever, 27 or 26 grow, another 41 import and use it for food purposes. So there is no example of any additional food safety considerations asked so far by any country, even Europeans, for the approval. Most of the countries have reviewed the dossiers and found them sufficient. But if you have any doubts, if we have any doubts, we can always get back and do that. I will give you an example which I will share with you, sir. If you think, like canola. Canola is one crop which is Brassica napus, which is widely cultivated in Canada, USA, and many other countries for oil purpose. All the canola oil that you get, even in Sri Lanka, as a purified canola oil, most of the imported oil is derived from the GM canola. So now in India, you all must have heard about mustard, the transgenic mustard studies. This is Brassica gentiana, which is a sister crop of Brassica napus. So now in our country, the safety, if you look at the safety studies on transgenic canola undertaken in Canada and in USA, they did only the safety studies in seeds, because their food use was to extract the oil and use the seed meal for animal feed. But when we were doing the safety evaluation in mustard, in our country, the mustard seeds, mustard leaves are used in one part of the country as a major delicacy, as a vegetable, So that is why when our safety assessment protocols were made, the developer added the safety assessment of leaves also, which was not done by the USA or Canada. So like which Dr. Pereira said, it is not that, the effect of processing, the plant part that you are using, all that is very important and that is what you have to see. But as far as the study is concerned, nobody repeats those studies because they're very expensive and you're not going to get anything. They are all using standard protocols. In fact, many of the countries, even the developed countries, for example, they are using Indian facilities to get these studies done. Or Indians are using, let's say Korea, this, that, everywhere, this is the laboratory-based contract research studies are very common. So those are not repeated, but the considerations, and that's where I said, things which look unimportant, like history of safe use, the knowledge about unmodified crop, actually those are the most important ones in your planning the safety assessment and undertaking that. Is it clear, Shanika?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Vibha, and thank you, Dr. Sashikaran. It's very clear. Any other questions from the participants?
So if anybody has any doubts, they can even write to us later. Sometimes people don't want to say it here. So you please feel free to contact later.
anybody has any questions?
सर वैसे लगा ना नींद आ रही है बेचारे बहुत रात है
Shanaka,
Yeah, I think we can close the meeting, right? Because it looks like we don't have any questions. So if there's anything, tomorrow we have the third technical session.
actually, as Dr. Ahuja said that if anybody wants to clear any doubts or anything, you can write to her, or even you can write to NSF, and then we can pass it on to them. You can get any clarifications.
Okay, then thank you.
Can we conclude the session, Dr. Ahuja?
Yes, please.
Yeah, let me thank all the international consultants, especially the presenters, Dr. Biba and Dr. Sashikaran, and other international consultants, Professor Tyagi and Professor Komila. And there are national consultants also who joined with us, Professor Atula Pereira. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all the participants. Hope to see all of you tomorrow also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Right then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.